Hello, this is Michael Chambers with a video on a new issue um, that's not Opus Dei related, but it's related to the Catholic Church and the wider Christian Church. I've had a lot of experience in my years of Catholic and other charismatic communities, and I don't know why, but God's asked me, I feel He's asked me to record something on the dangers of structures that use charismatic gifts, where people use charismatic gifts, um, and to explain why, how they're different to how they're operating is different to how what God really wants, as I see it. So, so it's another group of people that I'm going to make myself unpopular with, the charismatics, and if if anybody wants to send this video to them or to anybody, any group that I criticize, I don't mind, and I'm open to learning and seeing where this goes. Um, so essentially, what do I mean by charismatic groups? I mean people, groups that that equip Christians to and coordinate Christians in the exercise of spiritual gifts. So gifts like prophecy, healing, teaching, casting out demons, words of knowledge, these kinds of things that the New Testament church um, received after the coming of the Holy Spirit, Pentecost. Um, and You might think, well, how can that be a bad thing? How can these things be bad? And after all, they result in people coming to faith, coming to humility and love of God, repentance, forgiveness, freedom from afflictions, from diseases, from addictions, guidance on things in their life. So of course, none of those things is wrong in itself. So um, the central issue that I want to highlight that is that when a group or an individual uses the gifts of God for their own purposes, whether they realize that or not, or they will realize at some level, when they use it for their own purposes, they're elevating themselves above God, and then they're using God and His gifts for their ends. And this is particularly a danger for structures for groups, for organizations that have procedures, that have leaders, that have things that happen every week, every month, that have accountability structures in it. Um, so so imperceptibly, gradually, that the gifts of God are subjugated to the will of men and the will of women as well. And I mean, and we know that that's I'm sure even those groups would recognize that's a danger. I mean, the Bible's very clear on that. St. Paul's very clear on that. Jesus is very clear on that. Not everyone who says Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father. And St. Paul says, if you have faith that can move mountains, blah blah blah, but no love, then your faith is like clashing cymbals. It's empty. It's hollow. And Jesus was strict with the Pharisees, who obviously were the great teachers of their time. So so Jesus' approach to his in his own public life to gifts of the Spirit, charismatic gifts that we wouldn't have used those terms for Jesus. His approach was interactional. It was context dependent. He wasn't trying to set up an organization to administer these gifts. He wasn't It was in the context of relationships, of interactions, of real life, doing things with people that he loved, or people that had just asked for his help humbly. So when they could see him, when they could find him, and he resisted all attempts to be enlisted, for his powers as such to be enlisted, for the by the Jewish leaders or by the Roman leaders, or even by people that supported him. There was lots of he could have been very famous and had a huge ministry and he could have been healing millions of people rather than dying on the cross. He had that capacity to go big time with that ministry. So, but he didn't do that. And we might say, well, that's Jesus. It's different to us, but really, is he? He's our model. It's our greatest model, and he was very assiduous about saying that his kingdom was not of this world. And so, in my opinion, the church that he came to set up was a charismatic church. It does exists on the spiritual level and exists in the human level when we interact in love or interact in the way that God leads us to interact, not because of any structure. So as soon as we put ourselves under the authority of a structure, that structure has to be guided by God. And we have to know that for sure. And it's pretty unlikely, really. It's pretty unlikely. But how do we know for sure? Well, the fruits of the Spirit, the fruits are good or bad, and they show themselves in time. So even if people are healed, cured, you know, set free, all sorts of benefits from the spiritual gifts. But if at the end of the day there isn't this community of growing in love as a result, then it's not from God. So, and I would say that charismatic groups have this tendency to chew up people because it's so intense and it's deceptive. You might think, well, these gifts must be from God, but if they're not, if there's an intermediary in the way who's guiding the use of those gifts, i.e. another human being, then the fruit's not there. It might be short term, it might get short term fruit, but long term bitterness. And I've seen that in charismatic groups that I've come across in my life. What I've seen is a lack of affinity, across the organization. You might have people who like each other and are happy being with each other in it, cliques or small groups. But as a whole, these are often groups that are not, of people that are not closely aligned emotionally or even geographically, that they wouldn't normally be with each other in ordinary life. So, um, or they're somehow guided by some central authority way above the local level that's a sort of acting as a drag, as an intermediary, and adding a layer of bureaucracy to the whole thing. So, and also it's going to attract people who are seeking trinkets, seeking quick fixes, seeking glory, seeking something that can validate themselves if they're not haven't got a great self-esteem. I've got this gift. And I've seen in charismatic groups tremendous spiritual pride at the achievements of conversion of all the things that they can do. Um, but pride in themselves that they somehow the possessors of a deeper knowledge of God's truth than other people. And of course, they wouldn't say that. You can only experience that from the outside, and they would lose some insight. Being inside those organizations, they would lose some insight into the level of spiritual pride that has accumulated. And I've seen online various comments critical of, for example, the Toronto movement of Jackie Pullinger's um, what partnership with Vineyard Churches and her ministry out in Hong Kong. And you might think, well, how can that be possibly wrong? All these people getting free of addictions. But it's going to be a structure there. It's been there a long time. You've got missionaries coming from all over the world, kind of to be boots on the ground to lead these addicts and whatever. So, I've seen some testimonies of people who have been hurt by that organization after being in there for a long time. So it seems quite controlling from what I've seen, from what I can see from testimonies. So, if there is a sense in a charismatic group that they've lost sight of the affinity between people, or they can see that, that the people are using the structure for their own ends, even through weakness, through their own wounds. It has to be time to abandon it, to cut it, to let it go, to leave it and to see how God can work in a different, more natural way. And then and God knows there are all sorts of things, lessons that we can learn from going through those hard times. I had to go through hard times to learn the lessons that I know today. There wasn't any other way for me to do it. I had to be there. Um, but so, so I would say generally, you know, charismatic groups in the church generally avoid. I'm sorry to say, I'd say that they are going to be a subtle trap. Um, and it's better to kind of. And the other thing about it is that if you, most people I've discovered don't really manage that whole process of forgiveness in one lifetime on this earth. Okay, they might think they do. They might have done some forgiveness and think that's the whole thing. But a lot of us have very deep wounds going back right to the beginning of our lives that we're barely aware of. And they could take a really long time to come to the surface and really in a heartfelt way forgive and move on from. And that forgiveness has to be a physical thing as well. We have to be ready for it. We have to be able to stand outside the hurt that we're in. It can't be just words. Um, and if we push that too quickly, which charismatic movements can do, they can push conversion too quickly. There can be a kind of recoil, and a psychological recoil that we don't that we hold on to that bit that we haven't let go of yet, um, or that we think that we've done that whole process. And if we're in a group and leadership structure, church structure, where even the leaders have not completed that work of forgiveness, over time they're going to be using that structure for their own ends. Gradually, day by day, they'll hardly see it, but one day they'll see it more clearly, and God will try and get through to them. But their pride could be too big by that stage. And I think there are charismatic groups out there that are beyond redemption that just need to be scattered and for people to be set free from them. It's the charismatic revival is now several decades old, so there's some really legacy organizations out there that just need to fold and say, look, we've learned and we should let go. Thank you for listening.